All right, so let's get it started. Welcome to Trump, Kids, and Families Inside White House Watch. This is a discussion about the Imprint's ongoing coverage of the fairly frenetic pace at which things are happening in Washington, D.C., both with the Trump administration and Congress. My name is John Kelly. I'm the co-executive director of Fostering Media Connections, which exists, and we all get up every day to improve the conversation about children, kids, and families in this country through quality, independent journalism. We do that through several different programs that we have here. So I will just very briefly kind of take you through those. Abigail, who is running the slides very capably for us here, we're just going to have a few at the top, and then we're just going to have a conversation, has put in QR codes for anybody that doesn't know about any of these programs and wants to know more. We have the Imprint, which is our daily news publication, covers child welfare, youth justice, youth homelessness, lots of other issues orbiting kids and families in this country. Imprintnews.org, Fostering Families Today, which is our bi-monthly magazine that goes directly into the homes of both foster and kinship caregivers around the country. We have our Youth Voices Rising program, through which we engage young people with lived experience in these systems on things like how to write an op-ed or a reflective piece if they're comfortable and they want to. We will work with them towards publishing those things in our pages. And then the most recent addition to the Fostering Media Connections family is Safe Camp Audio. It's kind of our nascent podcast network. We have a few podcasts of our own. We help through Safe Camp Audio to just kind of help promote other quality podcasts and audio projects in the fields of child welfare and youth justice while we are at it. If you would like to stay current on all the things that we do through all of these programs, the easiest way to do that is through our newsletters. We have a weekly newsletter on all the Imprint's coverage, really just kind of the table of contents that comes to you every week, tells you what we've been writing about. If you're not able to just check that homepage every day, we have monthly newsletters that go out to our readers who are interested in the places we have full-time state reporters. That's California and New York, Minnesota, and Georgia. And then we also have monthly email newsletters on Youth Voices Rising, on Fostering Families Today, and then on Safe Camp Audio monthly. And Abigail has put at the bottom here the easiest link to just go and sign up for whatever ones of those you would like. That is fosteringmediaconnections.org / newsletter sign up. Last plug before we get to the meat of this event today. We are in the giving season, and we are once again here at Fostering Media Connections participating in Newsmatch, which is an annual nationwide campaign to strengthen nonprofit newsrooms like ours. So if you donate to the Imprint by December 31st, by the end of the year, that will double your investment in our newsroom. So you can make a contribution today. The QR code to the left on the screen is where you can go to easily do that. Small donors really help make this place go. It is some of the most important work that we do on the development side of this organization. So we really hope you will consider the contribution. So let's get started with what we're going to talk about. I'm just going to kind of quickly introduce it, and then we'll get to our national reporters who are here with us today. And I'll just basically say this, I don't think any of us really knew totally what to expect as the second Trump term began. There were certainly indications that big changes could be afoot with the advent of DOGE and some of the policies and pursuits that were laid out in Project 2025. On the other hand, the first Trump term, I would argue, actually had like more apprehension to it. And, on the issues we cover, it was somewhat business as usual early on and moved into a run that certainly included some pretty controversial things, especially around the handling of immigrant youth and families in this country. It also included the signing of the Family First Prevention Services Act, new funding for legal counsel for parents and kids, and also the reauthorization of the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act. But it was evident basically within a week that we were in for a pretty different and wild ride early on here. It was basically a fire hose of news developments really across federal government and its partners in the states and cities. And, from a news reporting perspective, I can really only think of two instances where I was in a newsroom just trying to get a handle on all the things you had to get your head around. One was the Great Recession. There's probably some people that are on this webinar today that were not born yet or were very young at that time. I was at a different outlet today at the time we were seeing the collapse of the global market financially and billions of dollars leaving the philanthropic organizations, lots of tough choices by states for years after that. I'm sure a lot of people on here do remember that part. And then the other one was really the first stage of coronavirus, when we immediately, as a team here at the Imprint and Fostering Media Connections, stood up a landing page and just started to crank out story after story, trying to make sure that in one of the most unstable and tragic chapters of our history here in America, system involved kids and families, and those systems that serve them were not a complete afterthought. So with all that said, we thought this would be a good time to just sort of reflect a bit on three things. First, what were some of the bigger stories and storylines that we worked on during the first kind of stanza here of Trump 2.0? What was that like for these reporters that you're going to hear from today, at just a really frenetic and different time of change and how to cover things accurately? And then third, we'll get into some of what these guys have their eye on as we move into the second year of this presidency in terms of what we're going to cover. So with that, I will stop yakking and I will pass it over to my colleague, Nancy Marie Spears, who is our Indigenous Children and Families reporter. Go ahead, Nancy.
Hey, as he said, my English name is Nancy Marie Spears. My ancestral name is Iowasawia, which translates to speak strong woman. I'm a proud citizen of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma. And I think honestly, some of the most impactful topics that I've reported on this year are really sort of the examinations of the federal government's complicity in the financial stability of tribes, particularly when it comes to anything from Indian boarding schools, the missing and murdered Indigenous people issue, all the way to child welfare and social safety net issues. I think, the Trump administration has, as we've seen, done a lot, millions of dollars in cuts to tribal programs affecting Indian country. We have tribes that are alleging that they were essentially stuck with the bill for boarding school costs. So between that and everything else that I cover, there are a lot of implications about the ways that the government's current instability could impact tribal sovereignty and self-determination more broadly. And so with that, I will pass it on to Michael or Sarah.
I'm muted. How did I do that? Michael, I'll pass to you next. Michael's one of our national policy reporters on child welfare, and has done a lot of coverage on a lot of different things in the last couple of months, but one in particular that obviously loomed very large were the kind of seismic changes to the social safety net that came through the Big Beautiful Bill. So Michael, why don't you tell them a little bit about kind of what we hit there?
Yeah, thanks, John. My name is Michael, and my vote for favorite candy was Reese's, which I mispronounced a couple days ago, which got some laughs from my colleagues. But yeah, thank you again, John. So as he mentioned, throughout the summer, we reported on one of the defining pieces of President Donald Trump's second term. That's what he referred to as the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. Opponents had other names for it that were not quite so positive. But on July 4th of this year, with B-2 bombers flying overhead, he signed that bill, and it was a truly sprawling piece of legislation at nearly 900 pages. So for the child welfare field, most of it didn't have any direct impact on the system. In fact, very little of it did, really. But there was a couple provisions that could have a profound effect on the lives of families and the systems and the child welfare systems that they're involved in. So, the vote was split almost entirely along party lines. It includes $4.5 trillion in new and extended tax cuts, increases spending on immigration and military, but more than $1 trillion in savings were achieved through new restrictions on Medicaid and the food stamp program, which I'm sure many people here are probably familiar with, as well as cuts to higher education and renewable energy investments. So as a result of this bill, every 6 months, this is probably the most direct impact on the bill in the child welfare system. Non-disabled former foster youth as young as 18 and parents with children over age 13 will have to prove they were employed, in training, or enrolled in school to be eligible for more than 3 months of the food aid program known as SNAP. So while there's no start date for that specific provision in the law, congressional staff told us at the time that it would apply immediately. But the bill is more explicit about the timing of the Medicaid changes. So starting at the end of 2026, non-disabled parents and caregivers of children 14 and up will also have to prove they've been working or otherwise community engaged for 80 hours a month. The poorest families will remain exempt from those work reporting rules. But requiring work in exchange for government benefits, it is popular in the polls, but many analysts have found that extra paperwork burden leads to broad reduction in benefits and enrollment. So Donald Trump, for his part, he said that those $1 trillion in spending cuts, you won't even notice it. And he just wants to capture waste, fraud, and abuse and target that with these kind of provisions. The co-founder of the Senate's Caucus on Foster Youth, Chuck Grassley, he called the work requirements common sense. But for opponents, including, I think, many advocates in the child welfare space, it's fair to say there's concern that the bill could create massive impact for children and families and new survival challenges potentially. And they cite things like the Center on Budget Policy and Priorities, which said that the SNAP cuts alone, 20% through 2034, about 4 million people, including 1 million children, could lose all or a substantial amount of their food assistance through SNAP. We also reported some of the voices that were weighing in on this at the time. Tom Rawlings, for example, former director of the Georgia Division of Family and Children's Services, he also warned of hidden costs for states, since so many adults in the child welfare system who might be facing an investigation rely on Medicaid, or if they're at risk of a child welfare investigation, and they require Medicaid to access substance abuse or mental health services to keep their family intact. And parents most in need of those services, Tom wrote in the blog Child Welfare Wonk, are also the most likely to go without coverage as a result of Medicaid work requirements. But nevertheless, some of Congress's leading Republican advocates for this legislation and legislation supporting foster youth did speak in favor of the bill's tax cuts, which will also benefit many families. So with that, I will pass it back to John.
All right, and so Sarah's going to talk a little bit about some really interesting work that we did on how things changed with the federal workforce that's focused on these systems. But before she gets to that, I'll segue off of kind of what Michael was talking about. Now he was discussing some of the big changes to SNAP that occurred as part of the OBBA. We'll talk probably a little bit more about the shutdown in a minute. But there's also kind of this new layer of things going on with SNAP as a result of that. Sarah and basically everybody here has done some really good reporting on that last week and this week. So Sarah, you want to just kind of quickly sum up like what we've found and what we've been doing there, and then you can talk about the workforce stuff.
Yeah, but first I want to say my chocolate thing.
Oh, go. Yeah.
I'm on Team Bougie, and actually Liz in the chat named one of my absolute favorites, which is the Tony's sea salt and almond. So Liz, I am with you. Let's get together. Let's break off a chunk of that. Yeah, so we have recently, as we are in this what feels like the zillionth week of this shutdown, our team at the Imprint has been working hard to kind of put that in the context of our audience and our coverage areas. We're trying to look at ways that this shutdown is specifically impacting children and families who are either involved in the child welfare system or at risk of it, which I think everyone on this call knows that these impacts are broad, but really have an outsized impact on vulnerable populations like this. So, the most obvious recent one we've been looking at is SNAP food stamps. This week, we all fanned out across the country and visited food banks in 3 time zones. That story's coming up later today, so be sure to hit that homepage after this to see just how much those lines were growing, just how strained our safety nets are across the country that, kind of help support these families in times of need. But before, when the government was in full force, full Doge speed ahead, John and I spent some time talking with folks who were impacted by the massive cuts to the federal government executed by Doge and Elon. And that was really interesting. It was a wild time. I'm sure you all felt that it was wild because things were every day was like a fire hose of news, and things would change drastically from morning reports to afternoon reports. We were able to talk to some folks who were impacted by the reduction in force in the Federal Administration for Children and Families, which was a different coverage area for me. Usually I am speaking with kids in the system or families in the system. So it was a different experience to kind of focus on the top down. But we knew that these massive restructurings to the federal workforce would ultimately have ripple effects on the ground in the ways that children and families are being served across the country. But it was interesting to be a part of that because everyone was so afraid to talk. You know, all of these folks were in really precarious positions. They weren't sure if they worked for the federal government, if they didn't work for the federal government, if they would get their jobs back, if they wanted to get their jobs back. So we had to walk a fine line. We had to be really careful with folks, and you know, not reveal anything identifying, which is not something we usually do for people in the government, right? Like I have experience keeping the identities of foster youth private because they're kids and you know, they're in vulnerable positions. But this was the first time I think that government officials were like, we can't talk to you. We're scared. We don't want to use our emails. But it was really interesting. And the way we were able to report on it, even though they were being anonymous, was that we were just hearing the same things across the board, right? Like we were talking to people in different parts of the country and they all had the same exact experience with just completely sloppy notices. We spoke to one person who hadn't even received a notice, but still got locked out of their computer, locked out of access. But it was months before she even got a layoff notice. So yeah, it was pretty huge. I mean, the Administration for Children and Families was cut. The workforce just between January and April, when we were reporting on it, was cut by 40%. Half of the regional offices across the country were closed. And so that means that the federal employees who were overseeing hundreds of tribes and state and county child welfare agencies in almost half the states just were not there overnight. And I don't know that we've seen anything like it. So big story.
Yeah. And I think Sarah hit on this, but to me, really one of the biggest takeaways, like how there are lots of ways you could feel about the size of the federal government and what everybody does in it. But what really came through as we started to source up there and report on this was just how uniformly haphazard people were characterizing the way that it was done in that one. So thanks, guys. I will just add one kind of thing that we also were focused on, and I write some of the stuff in our subscriber tier, Youth Services Insider. We had these guys writing about this as well, and some of our great freelancers that are kind of in our network. But one of the things we had to pay attention to in all of this was just federal funding, grants, both in the child welfare and youth justice space. And there was a lot to write about on that front, really in 3 different storylines that were kind of playing out all around at the same time. So one of the first stories we wrote, January 27th, there was a contract for an organization or an entity called the Child Welfare Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity Expression Institute. It's a mouthful. That was kind of summarily canceled. You fast forward to March, there was this kind of back and forth on contracts for funding around providing counsel to unaccompanied minors who had arrived at the border in search of asylum or protections. Those are often very young kids or teenagers. And so this is the contracts to provide lawyers to them to show up in court and actually make their case. That was halted at first. The contract was halted, then that was rescinded, and that was halted again. And now it's kind of still pending in the court system. And then April comes and there is a massive cancellation of hundreds of grants totaling up to more than $800 million, I think. Our analysis of the list that leaked out of those grants showed that at least 60 of them for about $170 million was very focused on either youth justice or other youth and family issues, but funded by the Office of Juvenile Justice at DOJ. And so the answer to that, why that happened from DOJ was that, and I'm quoting from them here in our story, the DOJ is focused on prosecuting criminals, getting illegal drugs off the street, and protecting American institutions from toxic DEI and sanctuary city policies. And they noted that discretionary funds that are no longer aligned with the administration's priorities are subject to review and reallocation. So these grant cancellations mostly dealt with funding that had already obviously gone out. It was approved in 2024 or even before that. But the Trump administration took over in the middle of the fiscal 2025 calendar year, and those grants were supposed to be competed out for like they normally are. You post the notices, people put in their grants, there's a big review process, and then sort of towards the end of the fiscal year, which is in September, the end of September, we find out who gets these discretionary grants. There's all kinds of different funding in the federal system. Discretionary grants is just one of them. And so both of the agencies that we focus on a lot, that's the Department of Health and Human Services, the Department of Justice, people were kind of waiting around for these discretionary grant competitions. They're waiting and they're waiting. And finally, it's late summer, and we still had not seen virtually any grant opportunities opening at Office of Juvenile Justice, only a handful at the Department of Health and Human Services. One that stood out to me at Health and Human Services, there's a program called the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act. It funds a lot of street outreach work, shelters, kind of an important part of that social safety net when it comes to runaway and homeless youth. And people are starting to worry. They're just not going to put these competitions out for new grantees. It finally did come out with lots of pretty new and complicated rules with just a few. Basically, I think it was like 2 business days, 2 weeks worth of business days to get that in. And then meanwhile, at the Office of Juvenile Justice, the administration began, inauguration happens, several grants get pulled back right away off of their website. We figure, okay, well, they'll probably rewrite some of the rules and then put them back out. And that never really happened. And finally, with a couple weeks left in fiscal 2025, which again ends in September, they start to show up. And the Office of Juvenile Justice position was, they'd have another full year to get that money out the door if they need it. Now that is complicated quite a bit by what's going on right now with the government shutdown. So I've talked about what got canceled and what's kind of in limbo because of delays in competitions. The other layer of this is that while all that's happening, there's also the business of starting the process on the new fiscal year, which is the one we're in now. And as you all know, that has not gone great due to the failure of Congress to get any sort of deal, even a temporary one, done here. That has led to the current government shutdown. But the sort of starting gun for the process of funding the government is really a president's request. That usually comes out in late winter. I've seen it as early as February. I think it's usually more around March. This one came out in June. So they were kind of behind the 8 ball to start with. There's no telling what a 2026 spending agreement is going to look like at the end of this, or if we will get one. But for what it's worth, Trump's 2026 request included plans to eliminate Job Corps, eliminate AmeriCorps, the Community Services Block Grant, and several other major programs for disadvantaged youth. He also proposed to take a lot of youth-related funding, though, that had specific purposes and sort of turn them and combine them into these consolidated blocks that would go out to states. So, for example, the Department of Labor, we have, Youth Build as a youth program, Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act as a youth program. The idea was to kind of create this big $3 billion, labor consolidated program and kind of make those options instead of kind of mandated things that were getting funded and sent out to states. So a lot going on with grants on just all kinds of fronts there. Was just one of the other of the many storylines that we had to tackle. So let's pivot away from kind of telling you what we wrote about and just sort of reflect a little bit on what it was like. I'll start with this. What to you guys have been some of the biggest challenges digging into these issues? Sarah, I think you got the ball rolling on this a little as you were kind of reflecting, but obviously sourcing in a time of uncertainty is a big thing, right?
Yeah, that was huge. And I do have to say, I've got big respect and gratitude to the folks who did kind of go out on a limb and talk to us, because it was an issue. The Doge cuts were a huge issue affecting so many, but there was a lot of fear. Susan in the chat mentioned it sounds paranoid, but it was real fear, and I totally agree. I mean, no one knew it was happening, and it takes serious conviction and bravery, I think, to talk to reporters in a time like this. So we were lucky to find some folks who did that. The other thing that was hard about it in terms of sourcing was that things were happening so fast and changing so fast that a lot of the sources who we rely on to kind of share their analysis, share their reactions to things that are happening either in the federal government or state or local governments, they didn't have answers for us. They were barely keeping up with what was happening. And so as we were trying to report in real time, we were hearing back from a lot of sources like, I'm so sorry, I can't comment on this. We're still reading through this. We're still trying to figure out how this is going to impact people. And so, that was certainly challenging as well. And I got to say, even representatives at ACF weren't keeping up. I had a situation where early in Trump 2, as we'll call it, I had reached out to ACF about a question. John and I were trying to figure out, with all of these regional offices cut, how are you now reallocating coverage? And they sent me something via email because their whole question and answer system is through a portal. And as we're getting ready to publish the story, my phone rings and it is ACF on the phone saying, wait, we got that wrong. Please don't publish what I told you. Give me some time and I'll get back to you with a new answer. So I just really think that encapsulates how chaotic all the information was and how unclear everything was for everyone involved.
Yeah. And so, Michael, Sarah was giving an example of a time we did get a response actually from the federal government. But one challenge that we've had here is sort of like just the level of communication in general, especially now that the government is ostensibly shut down, right?
Yeah, it was challenging because we wrote a couple stories about the incoming Senate confirmed appointee who now leads the Administration for Children and Families, Alex Adams. So for a couple weeks there, you're reaching out to the agency for comment about his background and his first moves in that position, but it was kind of radio silence, presumably because of the shutdown, whereas typically there's a lot more responsiveness.
Yeah, absolutely. I just think also one of the things that's like really felt unique is just deciding, like it's been very challenging environment to decide like what to allocate time to do reporting on and like how much time. Like the first thing that really sticks out to me was, real early on, like we're talking, I think late January, maybe early February, we find out that the administration has announced what they describe in a pretty frankly ham-handed legal notice, I guess, that they're going to just be freezing all federal grants. It was basically just presented as that, at least discretionary money. And so, we're all hands on deck, spend the entire night reporting on it, trying to get an assessment of like, how much money are we talking about? Who is immediately going to be impacted, like in a shutdown way? What does this mean for states, et cetera, et cetera? I think I probably kept everybody on this webinar with me up all night trying to finish that one up, and a few more people as well on our team. We did a great job with it. It's a great article that really gets it. It's really a shining example of what we do, which is to take these things that largely are kind of ignored by a lot of media and really shine a light on what exactly is happening. And by 10 a.m. the next day, they had rescinded that notice and basically just rendered moot everything that we had spent a lot of time on. So that was really fun. But that was just sort of a funny anecdote of just like how hard it was to kind of figure out how to deploy your time and your people. Nancy is known around our newsroom for always being loaded with a bunch of story ideas. So this must have been quite the time for you. How did you kind of triage and figure out where you were going to go?
Absolutely. Yeah. John, thank you for that question. So I do cover all of Indian country, which is 574 and counting federally recognized tribes. And, we're also counting state recognized tribes in that. And so, there is a lot to be thinking about in regards to this question. I mean, from my vantage point, a lot of it comes down to just what's most timely, right? Like every other newsroom, breaking news is going to take precedent in a lot of these cases. But beyond that, in my mind, a lot of the really hard decisions that we're having to make as reporters is figuring out if we have the capacity to do a story about something that might not be a story tomorrow. Let's forget breaking news for just a second, right? How many times have we as reporters, how many times have we been writing something, to John's point, he made a great example about this. We would write something about something that had just happened. We were about to publish it just to find out that the rug had been pulled out from under the story. It's happened, especially, happened to us in the early days of Trump 2.0. Certainly, we'd write about something, and then that piece of grant funding would be rescinded, or something would be clawed back, right? So it's not even always just the challenge of handling the constant onslaught of breaking news, which, to be fair, the 24-hour news cycle could not be more alive and well today than right now, right? But beyond the challenge of handling that constant onslaught of breaking news, we are also still, just constantly trying to figure out what we're writing about is going to still be relevant tomorrow. Times and things are changing constantly so quickly, and there's no way to fully predict sort of all of these different moving parts. Unfortunately, none of us have crystal balls with which we can see into the future, and that sort of everything I just said sort of underlines, I think, the gravity of the work that we do. Right? I'm a person who believes that the elephant in the room brings the room together. We are in the longest government shutdown in American history. There's no question about that. There's also no question that the longest government shutdown in American history is already having direct impacts on children and families. We report on it. Everyone here on this call reported about it. Our excellent state bureau reporters have reported on it. And these are children, right? These are kids. These are little humans who are going to grow up to shape our laws, our policies, our perceptions of ourselves, and the way that we move through the world just by their very nature of being the generation that comes after us. Right. So for me, it's really comes down to it's about the public's right to know about the welfare of children. I think the public should have a very vested interest in keeping these children safe. So even for topics that are not necessarily part of our beats, right? From everything from, an ICE raid on a child care center in Chicago, family separation at the border, these are all things that we as reporters still have to be aware of because it all informs sort of the calculus and the dynamic of the work we do and how and why we tell these stories.
Well said. Well said. So, we talked about like the challenges and sort of our normal process of getting people to talk to us, which has certainly been an interesting one. In this kind of unique reporting environment, what kind of tools or resources have you guys found helpful? Like, what are the kind of the go-tos and things that have really helped in this kind of weird news environment, Michael?
Yeah, well, I think working with Sarah and Nancy this year on covering the federal government, and it's moves throughout the year. I think we definitely learned that a lot of people are more comfortable on Signal, for example. It's kind of an obvious one. I think a lot of people have heard about Signal now. It's been all over the news for this very reason, for federal officials trading national security information on Signal to federal employees who are being riffed talking to reporters through Signal. So that's probably the main tool, I guess. But just in general, we've definitely had to lean heavily on trying to build that trust with sources that we will be careful if they do want to speak on background or anonymously or kind of blow the whistle on something. We do take it very seriously, trying to preserve their anonymity if it is necessary because they face risk of losing a job or a contract or something like that.
Yeah, for sure. Sarah, in addition to Signal, which is kind of a tech solution, I mean, there's also, lots of sort of resources out there. Want to throw some recommendations to people that maybe they don't know about that sort of we lean on our colleagues out there in resource world?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we all bemoaned the loss of the Child Welfare Information Gateway, which was the first
Well,
email.
not the full gateway, but child welfare in the news. Yeah.
Yeah.
The gateway.
Okay. Yes. Sorry. I
Yeah.
misspoke. Thank you for fixing that. That for the many years I've been covering child welfare was my first inbox go-to, and that is sadly no longer there. In its wake, the Annie Casey Foundation has, kind of stepped in and started putting together a newsletter, which is worth subscribing to if you're trying to keep up with the news in this field. And we here are all big fans of the new newsletter Child Welfare Wonk from the very intelligent and eloquent Zach Laris, who I think is doing the Lord's work by putting together a lot of research on the child welfare field and also putting it into context and offering some analysis. So that's been really helpful, I think, for us to not only keep up with new data that's coming out in this field, but also kind of angles and lenses through which to look at it.
Yeah, it is really a shame. I think that there's probably a lot of people on this webinar who got child welfare in the news into their inbox every day. I just want to say from, our standpoint, a lot of what we think about on the sort of production side of things here, right? Like these guys out there reporting, there's a whole team at Fostering Media Connections is figuring out like, how do we get this to the most people possible? And I don't think there's been a sea change in our ability to distribute quite like child welfare in the news, which started, I think, around, I'm going to get the year wrong, but I feel like it was kind of right before or after coronavirus. I think it was maybe right before. And they just did a really knockout job, really culminating, really quality reporting from around the country every day. And obviously, our stories were a lot of the ones that were on there. Nancy, you kind of cover like a niche within a niche. Like we're a niche publication, and then you got a niche inside of that. So what did you lean on? Like what was signing yourself up for to try to stay current?
Yeah, so many things. I mean, I think internal tribal statements is a big part of what I'm constantly looking at, whether that's press releases from tribal council members and things like that. But beyond that, I mean, a big part of what I've been sort of constantly monitoring, I guess, in this current sort of political climate that we're in is, in terms of what we've been talking about earlier, in terms of grant freezes and funding cuts. I mean, a big part of what I've been looking at is just like, how is the scholarly and research worlds impacted by this? How is the academic world impacted by these cuts and these grant freezes and all these things that are sort of, a big part of what we do as reporters is really lean on academic and scholarly research articles about the child welfare system that we cover. And so a big part of what I do is just really I have all these alerts set up on, just different academic websites about, just all, for any kind of keyword I can think of relevant to our beats in terms of just like, what is the new academic research coming out? How is it being impacted by the current funding climate and landscape that we're in? And then of course, like I have a lot of alerts set up on just like the money side as well. So like new grants, frozen grants, all of those things, I try to like make sure I have everything signed up to my inbox so that I can get immediate updates if something like that does go under, or if we do get new funding in other areas as well.
Right, absolutely. So we're going to go to questions.
Sorry, one quick note before we move on. I just wanted to say, it might sound like we're like really plugged in and connected, but we actually rely on all of you to tell us what's happening also. So please don't take this as, oh, these guys already know. We don't. We often don't. We miss a lot. So please,
thank
just
you for
anytime
saying
you think something newsworthy is happening. Thanks.
Thank you for saying that. I don't know how many times somebody's like, well, this or something happened. I was like, no, I mean, why didn't you tell me when you found out? That is super important. And we're going to put the emails for all these guys up on the screen in a little bit. So you have them as resources if you want to tell us what's going on, or you want to just spout off and share a thought on the field with us. The more the merrier, the more info we can hear about what's going on out there, the better. I was just going to say that event, like in a few minutes, we're going to go turn to any questions from the audience here. Also, we'd love to just hear from you if you have a comment on just what you think people need to know about what we should be looking at, what we should be reporting on. Feel free, fair game right here to throw something in the comments. Before we get to that, though, I'll ask the same thing of these guys. What are all three of you keeping a close eye on looking forward here as we move into year 2 of the Trump administration? Michael, why don't you lead us off?
Yeah, where to start? I mean, we're certainly keeping a very close eye on this administration for children and families and its new leader, Alex Adams. We've got a couple stories up right now, including one just this morning talking about his agenda and what his kind of early moves have been, and where the Trump administration in general might go in terms of how they are overseeing and regulating and funding or not funding states, counties, nonprofits in the child welfare and juvenile justice space. So, there was already so much activity this year. We're certainly expecting more of that, maybe much more, because now there is a Senate confirmed official in place at the top of that system. In addition to that, we're definitely interested in seeing how the federal legislation from this summer, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. How that is implemented over the course of 2026 is going to be probably a huge story. And then also just like how families and organizations kind of respond to all of this. I saw a question in the chat about what foundations are doing in response to these many funding changes in the child welfare, kind of adjacent or in the child welfare space. So we'll definitely be keeping an eye on all of that, and would love to hear about that from all of you for sure.
Yeah, Abigail, why don't you, if you can hear me here, why don't you throw up the slide we have with all of their email addresses, both Sarah, Michael, and Nancy's on that when you can, so that it's fresh in people's minds as these guys talk through some of their ideas here. But Sarah, what do you got? What are you thinking about? Sarah's working on a big project for us on a topic that will definitely tangentially involve federal policy and stuff like that. I'm not going to tip it too much here, unless she wants to talk about it. She can feel free to do that. But what are you thinking about in terms of covering the Trump administration?
We're going to keep that big project a surprise for now, but keep your eye out. It's coming soon, the next few months. In terms of kind of what we're talking about today, the federal child welfare policy and federal child welfare workforce, definitely keeping an eye on what the end of the story is going to be for the restructuring of the Administration for Children and Families. All of those, well, not all probably, but most of those reduction in force layoffs are being appealed either through class action lawsuits or through the administrative process. The latter of which is on hold because of the shutdown. So we're kind of waiting to see if those people are going to get reinstated. That is the goal of these appeal processes. So who knows, like how many ACF staffers we will have next year. So we're keeping an eye on that. And then, stemming from that, we're keeping an eye on, assuming the Trump administration's plans to cut that workforce do go forward, what will that mean ultimately? Because, our reporting so far has focused on what is happening with the workforce, how many people are being cut. And as that's happening in real time, it's too soon to know how that's going to impact the delivery of services, on the ground, what it's like for local child welfare agencies, and ultimately what it's like for children and families involved in the system. So we'll be looking on the fallout there. And not just that, but also, John talked about a lot of grant money disappearing from the nonprofit space. So I'm really interested to see how that impacts children and families, because as we all know, nonprofits do a lot of work both to support these families, but also to provide services that are court ordered for parents under investigation. So if we see the nonprofit space start to shrink, how is that going to impact what child welfare looks like in the coming years?
Excellent. And Nancy Marie, what do you think you will start looking at, or are already probably well on your way to looking at, vis-a-vis the Trump administration, Indigenous kids and families in 2026?
Yeah, absolutely. Like you said, John, I am a niche within a niche, but that does by no means mean that what I do is narrow or that there's just a few, things that I'm looking at. This is a very wide net that I'm casting. And really the things that I'm looking at most predominantly right now sort of fall into three buckets. The first one is the erasure of culture and history. I'm sure we've all on this call been looking at the ways that the Trump 2.0 administration has been trying to doing reviews on the Smithsonian Institutes. So the National Museum of the American Indian, the African American Museum. Lots of museums are kind of under review right now by the Trump administration in an attempt to really try to erase or sort of minimize the maybe embarrassing or shameful parts of our country's history that some would maybe rather forget. And this is obviously really key to my beat because, in addition to all of the Indigenous child welfare topics that I cover, including tribal child welfare, and best practices, I also do a lot of coverage in the Indian boarding schools space when it comes to boarding school survivors, their descendants, and the ways that truth and reconciliation can move forward in this country. We're in a place right now where the Trump administration is trying to actively erase that history. And the thing about that is the survivors of those federal policies and their descendants, they don't really have the luxury of forgetting the trauma of what happened to them. So that will be something that I continue to watch closely. The other, two buckets I would say that these things fall into is, I'm very much keeping a very close eye on further challenges to the Indian Child Welfare Act and other challenges to tribal sovereignty more broadly. We did see during the Biden administration that the conservative majority Supreme Court did rule to keep ICWA intact for now. But I'll be very curious because at the moment we do have a Minnesota Supreme Court case that we are awaiting a decision on that we do believe will eventually reach the United States Supreme Court. So, in that way, I will be very curious to see how Congress and the Trump administration more broadly respond to future challenges to the law and what their rhetoric may or may not look like. Another area that I'm thinking of in terms of just broader issues to challenges to tribal sovereignty is, birthright citizenship. This is something that I think child welfare professionals, folks that are steeped in the child welfare space, we should not, disregard or sleep on this birthright citizenship case. For folks that don't know, essentially what happened in that case, the Trump administration used historical legal precedent that involved tribes in its arguments to essentially dismantle what we know as birthright citizenship. If you don't know what birthright citizenship is, it's essentially the concept that if you are born on American soil, you are an American. But the Trump administration took issue to a specific piece of the citizenship clause of the 14th Amendment. That clause was the subject to the jurisdiction thereof. They actually used a case called Elk v. Wilkins, which is back in 1884. 1884. The Elk v. Wilkins case was ruled by the Supreme Court at the time. It was the case of a Native American man who was born on a reservation. He moved to a city in order to vote. SCOTUS at that time ruled against that man because he was not, according to them, subject to the jurisdiction thereof the United States and therefore was not eligible to vote in U.S. elections. The reason that that's something that plays into my beat is because, as we saw today in 2025, in June earlier this year, SCOTUS actually didn't rule to uphold or defend birthright citizenship. It instead just merely blocked an injunction made by the lower courts. And obviously, this is something that could very well reemerge in the next 3 years of the Trump administration. And from my vantage point, it does have very strong implications for tribal children born on reservations and their families, because today we understand that a big part of tribal sovereignty is tribes having the sole ability to determine citizenship standards, particularly when it comes to Indian Child Welfare Act cases. So it does make me wonder, as someone who, I used to be a Capitol Hill reporter, I used to cover the Department of Interior and the Supreme Court during the early days of the Biden administration. So for me, it does make me wonder what other legal precedents from federal Indian law could be used in the future to promote this administration's priorities in the ways that could directly or indirectly impact child welfare services on the ground. The other thing, to echo these wonderful colleagues of mine here, I'm also obviously going to be keeping a very close eye on ACF and its work to support tribes. There have been tribal consultations between the federal government and tribes that have been canceled during the government shutdown. Those are consultations that directly relate to child welfare services for tribes, particularly Title 4E services. So I'll also be looking at the ways that the government does or does not reduce the bureaucratic red tape around child welfare services. A lot of folks don't know, but something I hear all the time from sources is that, especially when it comes to sources of mine who are maybe current or former federal employees, is that the way tribes generally receive funding from the federal government, especially when it comes to child welfare and related social safety nets, it's complicated for a myriad of reasons. And tribes are often dealing with competitive funding for a lot of these resources. And I have sources that sort of belabor that fact in the way that, when we have tribes put in situations where they're competing with each other for this child welfare funding, it is at best problematic and challenging, and at worst downright dangerous for kids. And so the government shutdown is, and the impact on tribes, which I did a story recently on, if folks want to check out the story that I did on the Trump administration's government shutdown and the impact it has had on tribal communities. Something that has kind of come up is that, the shutdown is almost sort of a perfect microcosm for why a lot of tribal advocates and a lot of child welfare professionals in Indian country really feel strongly that there needs to be more funding with advanced appropriations. The government shutdown is sort of an exact reason why tribes fought for so long for advanced appropriations for Indian health services. And tribal leaders that I speak to are constantly advocating for ways that tribes can kind of keep afloat during a government shutdown, so that tribes are sort of insulated from the ebbs and flows of the federal government's priorities. And so those are, beyond with that, and in addition to a million other things, I'm sure those are the things I'll be immediately looking into in 2026.
No doubt. Okay, we're going to use our last few minutes here. We can hang a little past the hour if folks want to hang with us, and I'll try to get to as many questions and comments as I can. Two quick things. You've heard from these guys about this specific part of what we cover. We are doing another webinar in December where their boss, the great Karen Dessa, our executive editor, will be doing kind of a roundtable conversation with them on some of the other stuff that we have written about, because it's not all just Trump administration and federal policy. We write about a lot of other stuff. We have a lot of other reporters. So I'm sure Abigail has probably already dropped the link or promotion into the chat for that. If not, she'll do it here, I'm sure. You've got their emails here for you guys to use, and we do urge you to do so. So let's see what's been up in the chat, what we've been yakking. Lori Ford wrote, do you feel more kids will be seized from homes due to SNAP benefits being suspended? And I think that is kind of the $1 million question. I mean, certainly one of the things that everybody's going to want to know and will have eyes on and really be looking at intently is you've got enormous downsizing in some ways, or threats, like at least, to the social safety net when you're talking about changing the way the Medicaid works or changing the way that SNAP benefits work for both single people, but also for families and parents and stuff like that. Now, I just glancing at who's here, I think I saw Will Schneider. I'm sure there's some other researchers attending. And there's a lot of people out there that really just study this. What is the impact, and how do changes to financial assistance and the safety net impact child welfare decision making? So not sure if anybody else has some thoughts on that, but I think that I would not hazard a guess on it, but I think that is sort of like the blinking red light thing that a lot of people, including our team, will be really focused on, right? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and there is research that shows that states with stronger food assistance programs do see a decrease in child welfare interventions and entries into foster care. So it's certainly not off the table.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, to Sarah's point, there's all kinds of research that sort of supports the concept that this is something that could plausibly happen. I mean, there's huge bodies of other research that show that, when families are food insecure, it exacerbates other problems that the family is having internally. It could cause all kinds of other things that can kind of allow these kids to be swept up into the system when they otherwise may not have, if it just hadn't been for the food insecurity issue. So we do see there is lots of research that shows that when kids are experiencing food insecurity, it can have sort of ripple effects within the family as well.
Yeah, man, we had some great people on attending this webinar.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of people in our chat probably could probably done the studies. We'll refer some of them
we'll
that we're referring to. This has been widely studied. It's one of the most central questions in the child welfare field, I think. At least
we should do a webinar where we can call on people that are at the webinar to talk, because that would probably been a good idea. We could do that someday. To that point, the great Sid Gardner is here and asked, have we been able to track the responses from philanthropy and faith-based organizations to the federal policy changes? I guess my answer to that was I don't think we've done a dedicated story that just aggregated that, but I do think that these guys and other reporters have done a good job of getting those thoughts into stories when it's been relevant. But any other thoughts, guys, on that? I think it is worthy of. I get Sid's point that those are pretty important aspects of the conversation.
Yeah, well, it's like a lot of the impact on the child welfare system, as we mentioned, has been sort of indirect. Over the past year, there hasn't been a specific giant bill changing the child welfare system, but because of these changes to SNAP and Medicaid, and certainly the crackdown on DEI materials and grants that many organizations received, we have seen I think a lot of changes at service providers, right? In terms of foundations, we'd love to hear about it. If you're hearing about foundations that are stepping in to fill the gap for federal grants that were going towards child welfare activity or juvenile justice activity, or certainly same thing for our faith-based groups.
Seeing a couple people say, I loved child welfare in the news and definitely miss it. I agree. Maybe we should bring that back. Somebody should. Somebody really loves the painting behind Nancy. I agree. I love seeing it every time we do the.
I said the same thing 2 days ago.
Just skimming through here. What funding cuts are we worried about? I don't frame it as we're worried about, but um, what are we going to look at in terms of funding cuts and coverage? I'll just throw this one out there. I think that this term, this sort of like past 6 or 7 months, has really been about these changes afoot in Capitol Hill, and the next year and even the year after that, that's going to have, I think that we'll see a lot of action on the state level. A few of these guys have already written stories where, budget decisions and hard choices have been made with child welfare programs and other things in state budgets because they just don't really have a good handle on what to expect from the federal government. So I think that we'll see quite a bit play out in terms of state budgeting, and that's what we'll have an eye on. Anything else there? No, that's okay. I think that's a good one. Let's see. Oh, from Stacy Geringer in Geringer, excuse me. I know her last name in Minnesota. She asks, "Have we reported on the impact of immigration on child welfare?" I'll tee off by saying I think probably not enough. The way that we're kind of built here at the Imprint is kind of rooted in support to cover certain states and to somewhat cover child welfare policy on a national level here. I am very proud of the work we've been able to do in terms of covering some of these battles over what's going to happen with kids and families, either the ones who arrive here or who are living here in the country. And this will just definitely be something that I feel, we're going to have a lot more attention on in 2026. So I before I pass it over to Michael, who's got a point to make here, I definitely urge you to use the emails you saw on that screen, our Signal account, whatever, to hip us to anything you see happening out there in the country. Michael, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the purpose of this webinar, like we want to expand our coverage as much as possible to include issues like that. Covering the domestic child welfare system is certainly a full-time job, as well as youth justice to the extent we can. Immigration comes up quite often. We'd like to do a lot more, and we can certainly do that with the support of our readers and sources on this call. So yeah, we'd like to, but we're small, so we try our best just with the areas we've already kind of mentioned today.
I actually do. I would say though, if you go, we have a decent search function on the Imprint website. If you go to it, of the many different angles and tangents of immigration policy and how it connects to child welfare, I would say the most that we have focused on over the last, call it 5 to 6 years, has been on the way that unaccompanied minors are cared for and supported in this country, because it is a really unique thing. I mean, when people make the reference like the national child welfare system, we all know that that's not a real thing. There's 50 states and tribes and territories that administer the vast majority of child welfare, but there is a national foster care system, and it's the ones that takes care of unaccompanied minors who are largely put in shelters to start with, and then often placed with sponsors once that's appropriate or they find a safe place for them. So if you go, I think if you just kind of search unaccompanied, honestly, in our Imprint News search function, you're going to get a lot of that coverage in our back pages there.
We also have a forthcoming story by our colleague Jeremy Loudenbach about a young man who spent time in foster care and is caught up in the immigration system now. So I don't want to ruin the surprise, but that'll be coming up, I think, very soon, right?
Yes, it is. I don't have the exact date off the top of my head. Oh man, so I'm seeing a lot of comments and ideas for us on stuff to cover, and I'm super appreciative of that, because I think I don't think so we're already past the hour right now. So I think it would probably go another 30 to 40 minutes if I was to start throwing these out, and we could, it would be fun to just have kind of a like impromptu live news meeting about these ideas. But just know that we capture all this stuff from the chat, and we really thank everybody for coming today and putting this stuff in front of us. It's really helpful to us. We super appreciate everybody who attended today for this webinar and who reads us regularly. Like I said, easiest way to do that, if you don't already, hit up our newsletters. We'll just email it to you, let you know what's going on. Check out our podcasts, our homepage, imprintnews.org. So with that, I just want to thank everybody for joining us today. And check back with us next month for a wrap up of all the other coverage that these guys and all of our other reporters did this year. So Nancy, Sarah, Michael, thank you for joining me to break down all of the coverage that has been thus far White House Watch. Thanks, everybody.